Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff here. I'm delighted to have my old friend Gene Steuerle on Economics Matters, the podcast. Gene's got a remarkable career that's still ongoing very actively. He's the Institute Fellow and Richard B. Fisher Chair at the Urban Institute. The Urban Institute does a slew of research on fiscal policy for the government and for just for research funded by institutions, foundations. Gene's the co-founder of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center. And when you're hearing about a new proposal, either by the administration or by the opposition, when it comes to fiscal policy, it could be a new tax change, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. Anything major is going to be evaluated by the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center, in addition to the Congressional Budget Office. And this is like the independent check on what the CBO is estimating. So it's a very important institution, the Urban Institute, and the consortium between the Urban Institute and Brookings, the Tax Policy Center. And Gene's the co-founder of that. And he's also the co-founder of the Urban Institute Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy and other Urban Institute programs that he's been involved in. And in the past, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Tax Analysis. That's the highest ranking personal finance or fiscal authority at the U.S. Treasury. So it's a very major position, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Tax Analysis. He was Vice President of the Peterson Foundation, co-director of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center, as I just mentioned, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. So he's not, Brookings tends to be more on the left of center. AI is more of the right of center. Gene is really right down the middle when it comes to politics. He's not into politics. He's into the facts and the truth and what we should be doing in our problems. As you'll hear, he was the federal executive fellow at the Brookings. He's a columnist for Tax Notes and the Financial Times. He's had all kinds of positions. He's worked with the National Tax Association as the president, the chair of the board of advisors for the National Center on Philanthropy, chair of a National Academies panel on the use of economic evidence to inform investments in children. The list just goes on and on. If you just Google Gene Steuerle you'll see his Wikipedia page. He's worked for the IMF and other international institutions for countries like China and Singapore and Slovakia on missions from the IMF. And then he's quite the scholar. He's written all kinds of research papers, but also I think he's got 1,500 articles. These are briefs, reports, columns, congressional testimonies. But also he's written 18 books. And the most recent, or one of the most recent of these books is called Dead Men Ruling. At deadmenruling.com, you can take a look and purchase the book. It received the Paul Samuelson Award that's awarded by the TIA CREF, that's given out annually to the best book in personal finance, and he's received this book. And the book's more about fiscal policy, but it's received this very prestigious award. He's written about contemporary U.S. tax policy, advancing the power of economic evidence, inform investments in kids. He has a column called "The Government We Deserve" that he's still writing at Substack. So you should follow him on his governmentwedeserve.substack.com. You should get a subscription to that, either paid or unpaid. Main thing is to read his work. Anyway, Gene, delightful to have you here. And I want to first of all, say how great it is that I've been able to be in touch with you and talk to you and be a friend of yours for so many years. But then I also want us to do a little homework here, which is tell the listeners and the viewers, just to start off, about how you view the overall fiscal situation in the country, and then in general terms, what we need to fix and why we're stuck in this kind of situation, and explain in the process of all this title dead men ruling. What exactly does that mean when it comes to fiscal policy? Why do we have the dead people ruling our fiscal situation? So let's start with, how you view, given we've got no Speaker of the House and the other Speaker, McCarthy was just dethroned because of allegedly being fiscally irresponsible. This is Matt Gaetz. He and other members of the House just kicked Kevin McCarthy out of his job. I think this is the first time a Speaker of the House has been booted from that position. So it's a big deal. And we have no speaker as we're speaking right now, so we can't pass any kind of legislation of any kind to help Ukraine, to deal with Israel's the terrorist ongoing terrorist situation in Israel, to assist Israel, or to do anything until we get a speaker. And it may be weeks or months until that happens. Who knows? Because the Republicans are so at each other's throats. There's how we got there, but what's the overall picture? Take it away. Tell us, how you see, in your long experience with U.S. fiscal policy, how you see things evolving.
That's a lot to ask, Larry. Let me try. I think some of our current problems, and I don't want to exaggerate. I'm not a one variable economist. I don't think there's just one answer to multiple sets of problems. But I do think that our inability to even enact good budget policy and to actually do a lot of other things actually does relate to the fact that Congress, at least the members of Congress, have turned to things like cultural wars to be able to get attention. So it's not unusual for our elected officials to fight among themselves. But traditionally, on the fiscal side, revenues came in automatically with government once you established a tariff or income tax or anything else. And when you have a growing economy, those revenues grow. And so the job of Congress is to figure out what to do with those revenues. Now, they can return them back to the taxpayer in the form of tax cuts if you want, but with just a flat rate tax, much less a progressive tax, the revenues keep rising over time. And so Congress has never really had that much problem giving the money away or doing something with it, right? I mean, it's pretty natural. And of course, the members of Congress like to tell us what they're doing with our money, the things they're giving us. They seldom discuss what I call the takeaway side of the budget, which is how you finance all the things they want to do on the giveaway side. But that's been relatively easy to do until modern times. And the dilemma is caused by the fact that dead men, and they are generally men, legislators from the past kept putting into the law more and more provisions, more and more laws that set forever the direction of programs. And it wasn't just that the programs were made permanent, unlike, say, discretionary spending when you're building roads or highways or beefing up land grants for a while to various states. Once you put in permanent programs, they don't have to go through an appropriations process. And the dilemma in the permanent programs really resides in the fact that so many of them have growth built into them. And we could get into the details of how they do it. But basically, if you look at the way Social Security was designed after the mid-'70s, and the way Medicare has been designed from the beginning, they're scheduled to grow forever. And for reasons I could get into, they're scheduled to grow forever faster than the economic growth and revenues. So they start absorbing more and more of the outlay side of the budget, and the revenues are growing, but they're not growing as fast as the spending. So all of a sudden, I should say all of a sudden, over several decades, you've built up this system where now the spending curve, the automatic spending curve, is growing faster than the revenue curve. And what that means is that the job of elected officials is no longer to figure out how to give away this extra revenue that keeps coming in every year with economic growth. Now the job of legislatures is to decide how to renege on past promises to be able to get this system into balance. And they can't do it politically. At least they haven't been able to do it politically.
They're changing the subject and talking about culture rather than the fact that they put in place, or other people in the past have put in effect, a Ponzi scheme in place, taking from the young to give to the old for these entitlement programs. And because of aging and because of changes in, well, I guess the inequality like in earnings, I know that Social Security's revenues are suffering because more of the earnings, bigger share, ever bigger shares is above the taxable earnings ceiling. So that's, one of the aspects that is not being adjusted.
Well, in addition to that, by creating permanence of these programs, it's not amenable to other changes. So one of the reasons for the growth in Social Security, and it's a big reason over time, even though year to year it looks small, is the fact we really never adjusted. Well, we made one small adjustment for the fact that people are living longer and longer. So a typical couple now who retires at 62, if they have average life expectancy, will get benefits for about 30 years. That's about 20 years each in terms of each individual life expectancy, but the longer living the two is liable to make it to about 30. Or to put it in language that's more common to most people picking up articles in the paper and social media, is it's not uncommon for at least 1 out of 2 people to make it to age 90. So that wasn't adjusted. And then the big adjustment that's going on now is that the decline in the birth rate took place in the mid-60s, and the system was never designed to adjust for that. And of course, that doesn't start really playing out on the benefits in Social Security until you get to 2008. That's when the first of the baby boomers start retiring or hit age 62. Yeah. So the system was never, by creating all these permanent provisions, it's not adaptable to the new needs of the economy. And in fact, we could get into this in detail. I would argue Social Security, huge number of these programs, the money's not going for the biggest needs in the economy. Like one of the biggest healthcare needs right now has to do with these deaths of despair, from opioids and obesity and everything else. The healthcare system is not adjusting to that. It's still, it's spending more, but in acute and chronic care, but not in preventative care. So we're just not adjusting to new needs. And so the system, the problems actually start multiplying on each other in this fiscal space. And as I say, the elected members are afraid to say, we or somebody in the past has made too many promises, but we don't want to cut back on it. I should add, by the way, on the Republican side, you have in the late 70s, Jude Wanniski, who was an editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal, wrote a piece called The Two Santa Theory. And he argued that Democrats have gotten to be Santa Claus, mainly on the spending side. And that's why the Republicans, could never win elections, or could sort of win elections. You may remember that the Republicans didn't have the House of Representatives under their control, except for 2 terms all the way from 1932 to 1994. They only had it for 4 years out of that. And that's partly because the Democrats appear, at least this is the argument of Winsky, they keep giving away money, and we're saying we're going to be the fiscal guardians. So Winsky argued, let's stop being the fiscal guardians. Let's start giving away money on the tax side, the way the Democrats do on the spending side. And then we'll also argue that some extreme version of supply side economics means any tax cut will pay for itself, no matter what rate you start at. And right. So the problem, just as I say, the problem keeps multiplying.
So at this point, Gene, would you conclude that the country's bankrupt, fiscally speaking, if we were to maintain the current fiscal policy, not have any fundamental structural reform of Social Security, healthcare, the tax system, is what we're doing sustainable?
Well, it's not sustainable. I mean, if you can't have, it's I paraphrase Herbstein, what can't continue won't. I think his line was more, what can't go on forever will not go on forever. But No, it's not sustainable, and I think everyone actually knows that, but they're not willing to deal with it, or at best they're willing to deal with it in short-term fixes. I should say also that we went through a number of fixes in the particularly in the 1980s and in 1990s, but they were short-term or medium-term fixes. They never solved the basic problem, and I don't think that type of fix works anymore, where you just try to solve what's coming along for the next 5 years or 10 years, because all of this is accelerated. This growth, this compounding growth I'm talking about has meant that the pressure becomes greater and greater over time.
So the way I like to think about Herbstein's statement, or to amend Herbstein's statement that what can't go on will stop, is that what can't go on will stop too late. And if you go back, for example, to the Greenspan Commission in '83, where they were supposed to fix the long-term fiscal problem of Social Security, the unfunded liability, they decided to look out just 75 years. We're now and ignore the fact that there were large cash flow projected deficits after 75 years, and we're now many years into that 75-year window, so looking too short term, and then not even dealing with that 75-year unfunded liability, the assumption being that the economy would absolutely die after 75 years, it would just end, or nobody would receive benefits thereafter or pay taxes. That was ridiculous, but that's still the focus of Congress, just the 75-year horizon. So what they did is they kind of operated on a tumor. They decided to operate on a third of the tumor. And now if you look at the size of the tumor, it's about twice as big as it was when they did their operation back in '83, in the sense that the required tax hike, FICA payroll tax hike, if you think about the percentage point increase, it's 4.7 percentage points to get rid of, to be able to pay for the time path of Social Security benefits through time, not just 75 years, but over the infinite horizon. According to the trustees report, you need a 4.7 percentage point increase. If you go back to the trustees reports before the Greenspan Commission, we needed more like about a 2 percentage point increase to deal with the infinite horizon of liability. So from that metric, where the tumor's gotten twice as big.
And a little footnote to that, which is just consistent with what you said, is the way they designed a reform in '83 to be in balance over 75 years meant that when you got near the end of those 75 years, you were running fairly big deficits. What that meant is that in 1984, essentially they meant that the system would go back out of 75-year balance. Right. That is, 75 years after '84 would be out of balance, even though the 75 years, the way they did the accounting from '83 would be in balance, because you're basically starting replacing a good year where you're building up a tiny bit of surplus with a bad year where you're running deficits.
Right. And this was a respected economist named Alan Greenspan running the commission. You had Senators Moynihan, and you had other well-respected senators from the Republicans. It was all made up of politicians and Greenspan. Maybe there was one or two other people who are not politicians, but this is what you get when you put politicians in charge of dealing with, what we need really is some technocrats running the country for several decades to get things fixed. This is not unlike Italy or Argentina in terms of how the politicians are manipulating what people learn. I mean, nobody is telling the public that we're operating on looking at when these trustees reports come out, even the trustees, which include the Secretary of Treasury, she's the chief trustee, my good friend Janet Yellen. The discussion at the beginning of the trustees report, which came out on March 31st of 2020 this year, it doesn't say anything about the infinite horizon unfunded liability, that it's like 60%. Well, the 75-year unfunded liability, 60%, 40% of the 65.9 trillion infinite horizon unfunded liability that they report in Table 6F1, way in the back of the appendix. It's so far back in this report that it's almost out of the report. It's
Well,
so it's
the dilemma now is, in some sense, the people that wanted to have higher benefits have sort of won the game. We're so near to the day of reckoning when the trust funds run out of money, in the sense that they run out of the any assets with which
yeah.
they can spend down. We're so close to that day that there's no benefit type adjustment you can make even today that can possibly get the system back into some sort of at least even current level of balance. And so that means in the short run, most analysts have concluded that you're inevitably going to have either tax increases or some borrowing from general revenues to be able to support the system for a while. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention to the long run. I looked at some of the work done by the Steve Goss and the actuaries, and just adjusting the retirement age with longevity. So if we live a year longer, we would continue to have the same number of benefits, not have an extra year of benefits. By the 75th year, that ended up covering close to half of the actuarial imbalance, or not the actuarial imbalance, but the annual imbalance in that year. But if you start adjusting today, it does little or nothing for the first 5 or 10 or 15 years. And that's why I put such emphasis on these growth rates that are built into the system and the extent to which we need to build new flexibility into the system. And going beyond Social Security, I keep trying to, in most of my writings, keep trying to make the point this is not just a future problem, and it's not just waiting for the system to blow up. It's actually causing all sorts of problems now. So in point of fact, by a number of measures, including those of the Congressional Budget Office, the elderly have higher incomes than the non-elderly. And yet we're asking the non-elderly to contribute ever more of their earnings to support future elderly benefits, when the needs now of the non-elderly in many cases are equal to those of the elderly. There's also a crazy aspect of Social Security. They keep shoving off some of the really desperate people among the elderly off into things like what's called supplemental security income. And that doesn't really adjust the way Social Security does. So we still have a number of elderly in poverty. And the system's quite rich enough to solve the elderly poverty problem. But there's a refusal to do it because they've already pre-committed all this money. A final aspect of this that I get into is and this require a lot more explanation, is I think a lot of the growing wealth inequality we've had as a society is related to these fiscal, and if you want, monetary policies that can continue. The monetary policy one being, well, let me give you a simple number. Let me summarize it in terms of interest rates. If you look at 1980 versus today, the debt to the public has quadrupled from about 25% to 100% of GDP. The interest paid by the government, now mind you, there's some accounting problems here, I know, but the interest paid by the government, the way they account for it, as a share of GDP didn't grow at all. So debt grows fourfold and interest costs don't grow fourfold. Well, that day is another day that's ending. And I think we see it in these rising interest rates, which I don't think are just a temporary phenomenon. We've lived off of these very low, if not negative, after tax, after inflation interest rates for most of the 21st century. And I don't think that can be sustainable either. I don't think that can continue forever using Herbstein. And so now as interest rates go up, it's no longer the case that the rising debt doesn't cause interest costs to go up. Now they will build on each other, right? So the rising debt not only will increase interest costs at a given rate, it's going to increase cost even more because the rates will be able to rise or at least stay in real terms closer to where it is now.
Yeah, the CBO Congressional Budget Office is projecting in its latest long-term budget outlook, it's projecting that in 2053, we're going to have a debt to GDP ratio, and this is really debt in the hands of the public. So it's a little bit lower number than gross debt, which a lot of people talk about, like Matt Gaetz when he was kicking Kevin McCarthy out of his job. He and his other gang of 8 members was referring to the gross debt as being 33 trillion, but the net debt, after you consider how much of the debt has been bought up by the Federal Reserve in exchange for, let's say, newly printed money, that's about 100% of GDP right now, 94%. It's actually gone down due to inflation in the Biden administration. So, but the CBO is projecting it to go up to 153% of GDP. And therefore, that's the net debt as a share of GDP. Gross debt as a share of GDP would probably be, it's 183% of GDP. Did I say 183% of GDP? And the gross debt would probably be 200% of GDP. So the CBO is showing that this is just not sustainable. Social Security trustees report is saying we've got a massive problem just with Social Security, that we need to go from a 12.4% combined employer-employee FICA tax to 17 percentage point immediately and permanently, let's just say today, to just keep Social Security solvent. And we've got Medicare projected to grow out of control, continue to grow, Medicaid because of the aging and because of healthcare cost growth. So the whole thing is a picture of disaster awaiting the country, awaiting our kids. It looks very much like Argentina. Argentina was had about 80% of our per capita GDP in 1920, now has about 14% of our per capita GDP. So countries that run for long periods of time terrible fiscal policy end up destroying national investment, growth, and end up with super high marginal taxes, and inflation, and people don't want to work. So you have a bigger black market economy, informal sector. The whole thing seems to be where we're heading. What would you do if you were president?
As I say, I think, well, I agree with that. I think the focus on something happening down the road is dodging the issue of what we're doing to ourselves right now in terms of what we're not doing. We're saying we can't afford to support Ukraine. Whatever you think about that issue, it's not costing that much relative to our economy. We say we can't deal with, I mentioned, diseases of despair. We've really cut way back on what our children and youth have. Student debt policy has been like a disaster. It's not unrelated. And it's going on now. So I think what we have to do to be able to get some public attention to this is to recognize that these costs are current. Admittedly, they've been hidden a little bit by this declining interest rate that we've had for some time, but the costs are current. They're taking place right now. There's a lot of squeezing out of things that we could be doing or should be doing. And even if you want smaller government, I think Republicans and Democrats alike would agree we could do a lot of things better with whatever money we spend, right?
Absolutely.
But remember that it's not just that so much is committed to programs like Social Security and healthcare. It's that over 100% of the growing revenues are committed. So at the margin, it's the new things that we're blocking from happening that make a difference. I'll give you an example from history too. There used to be big debates over whether what was called AFDC, aid to families with dependent children, now called temporary assistance for needy families after some Clinton era reforms. That in the 1960s, that occupied about half of all the social spending for the non-elderly. And it was a moderately big program. It had grown, that way through a variety of reasons. Well, over time, it wasn't indexed to grow that much, except for a number of people. And it declined and declined and declined as a share of GDP and got replaced, not so much by some direct reform, but over time, it started getting replaced by things like food stamps, now called SNAP, and the EITC. And while I'm not saying those are perfect programs by any means, I think they were better than what we had before. And the fact that the AFDC is not scheduled to grow and would decline over time in importance, even though at that time it was an entitlement, it was a permanent program, it was still declining in importance. So there was still room to allocate these growing revenues to something else and maybe something better. Yeah. So that's part of the trap now. We can't allocate our money toward what we would agree upon as a people needs priority.
Right. I think it's very important point that the crunch is here now. It's not just down the road. And down the road is not that far when it comes to Social Security, because on a cash flow basis, I think it's 2034, we're going to need a 20-25% benefit cut just to, according to law, that we have to cut benefits if we don't have enough money in the trust fund to cover the
well, and the hospital insurance portion of Medicare is going to run out of funds even sooner than Social Security.
Yeah. And then you have, another thing that Matt Gaetz needs to learn when he was talking about the fact that, spending on Ukraine is somehow the reason that we have this huge gross public debt, and that but the reality is that the 2/3 of spending is on entitlements, is mandatory, is outside the ability of the House of Representatives, anybody in Congress, to change. It's on autopilot. And the amount that he was talking about of spending that the House could actually control is maybe 10-13% of the total budget. So, and you do see from academia's perspective, you see major reductions in relative to GDP, relative to where we would otherwise have been for example, funding of the National Science Foundation. So when I was a grad student, lots of kids were on National Science Foundation scholarships, and then you had a lot of research being funded by the NSF. Today, it's essentially impossible to get funded by the NSF.
But when you and I went to college, it was not that great of a burden either.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So, this whole reliance on, in fact, I think we in the economics profession really get this wrong. I know a lot of economists who look at student debt, and they compare the debt that one might incur relative to the assets they might build up if they get educated. So even for the person who succeeds by going to college. But I think what this ignores is that as we've displaced support for students in undergraduate school with more and more debt, we've added to their financial debt, but we really haven't added to the net amount of human capital that's being developed. That is, we're not really putting more people through college and with better courses. So if you think at the margin, anytime you want to incur more debt, you want your buildup of assets to be greater. If you're just merely incurring more debt so that you can finance consumption by other people, not necessarily by the students, you actually are just decreasing the net worth of the young people. And if you look at any of the statistics, such as from the Survey of Consumer Finances, on the extraordinary decline in the wealth of young people, that's related to this transfer by deciding, well, students could pay more in debt or gather up debt while we finance other consumption by government. And then that has another repercussion in the sense that you have more and more students now delaying family formation, buying homes, so they're not building up wealth that way. So this is just another example how these forces, they interact. Well, you know this well, Larry. It's within the budget. Everything interacts. You can't move one thing in a budget without having a repercussion somewhere else in the budget, right? Because it's got these constraints that has to add up in some way.
And then you have 40.
The way it's getting up now is not good.
Yeah, then we have about 40% of the kids starting college who don't actually finish. So they borrow for really for nothing in terms of the outcome, but they have to pay it back potentially through the rest of their days. I know a lot of people personally who are still paying back their student loans in their 60s. I think there's something like 3 million people in that boat. I was reading the other day, some lady had a student loan obligation, started out around $50,000. It's now $500,000. She's stuck and of course, if you can't pay back, interest will accumulate. And if you've borrowed at a high rate, because right now rates are high, and probably presumably setting those student loan rates a high rate, if rates come back down, you can't refinance at a lower rate unless you do it through the private sector, which is going to be very expensive too. So anyway, let's talk about solutions. What would you do, Gene, if you were president?
Well, if I was president, I would. Well, I think you know, Larry. I was the economic coordinator and original organizer of the '84 Treasury study that led the Tax Reform Act of '86.
Okay.
And what we did in that act, which I think was unique, is we really took a broad look at taxes. In fact, we took a broader look than had ever been done before by Treasury. I mean, we got into the nitty gritty. We got into even such things as tunnel bores, which I didn't even know what they were, but it's whether you depreciate the bores that are made through mountains so that the railroads and highways can go through them. But we looked at everything because we decided this needed a comprehensive look. And what that allowed us to do, which was somewhat unique, is we actually changed the burden of proof in the political debate. And so what do I mean by that? Traditionally, when you come in budget or tax or spending items, we sort of argue things one at a time. And when you get to what I'll call the takeaway side, which that Tax Reform Act did have a lot of, where we cut back on a lot of things in order to finance what we wanted, which was partly the rate cuts that Ronald Reagan wanted, but also the efficiency that a lot of Democrats wanted. But we had a lot of takeaways. And usually when you go in and have a laundry list of takeaway items, the people who get hit say, why are you picking on me? Larry Kotlakoff's got these great benefits. Why'd you come after me, Gene Steuerle? Well, when you try to be comprehensive, it sort of changes the terms of the debate, because now someone comes, if I want to protest, what your response can be if you're sitting in Treasury or you're the president, well, wait a second, why should you, Gene, be accepted from some general rule, some general reform that's going to involve everybody is joining in the effort. So I don't think there's any way out of this fiscal dilemma, compounded by what I think is going to happen in monetary policy. I don't think there's any way out without asking a lot of the public relative to what they think they've been promised. But as I say, what they've been promised is unsustainable, and it's mainly growth and benefits in the future that's unsustainable. It's not some current level. We don't need to cut back on the Social Security benefits of existing elderly people. We just need to figure out some ways to slow down that growth. And that's how I would explain it. I said, we've got to be in this together. That's going to be a hard item to fix. I don't know that a Congress can do it without strong presidential support. But I think the effort's got to be comprehensive. And I say in '84, '86, we were only trying to be comprehensive in the tax code. Now we got to be comprehensive from the tax code across to the spending items. In fact, beyond that, I think we've got to organize government to do this, and we could go this separate matter. I don't think there's any agency of government that's even ready to be able to do those types of analysis. Even the sub pieces, such as housing policy, integrating housing policy from HUD, Housing and Urban Development, with housing policy and Treasury through the tax code, with housing policy that the regulators do by the way they try to control lending policies through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We wanted to have a good housing policy promoting home ownership by those who could benefit from home ownership. We need a much more comprehensive approach that cuts across agencies, and I don't think government's as actually even organized to do it. So it's a big lift that I'm asking for, but I don't know any way out of it. I don't know any other way out of it.
No,
other than, as you say, to sort of go through the one little disaster after another, and then have some reaction or count on the Fed to just bump up interest rates like crazy to some other have us go through a major crisis to get something back to normalcy.
Yeah, it's very difficult when you have not a single PhD economist in Congress, as far as I know. You've got President Biden, who's taken Social Security off the table politically. Trump is saying the same thing. Everything we take off the table, we leave in our kids' laps, right? It's in our own, as you're saying, this is not all in the future. It's happening right in front of us every day. So would you, my view on Social Security, just to be clear, would be that we need to basically freeze the existing system in place and put a brand new one in its place for current workers and future generations, one that people are investing collectively in a global index fund, like a Singapore type provident fund, with government contributing on a progressive basis to help the poor and the disabled, the unemployed. And we'd keep the payroll tax in place to pay off the accrued liabilities under the old system. So we pay off what we owe under the old system, but we'd shift to a new Social Security system that was fully funded. And yeah, this would be a bigger burden on younger people, but promising something to them that they're not going to be able to collect anyway is not, which is what we're now doing. They're in effect, they're being hurt over time by what we're doing. They just haven't been told about it. So
you have a dilemma in a system that is almost entirely pay as you go. As you know, this is that the transition you're talking about requires some generations to pay twice, right? They have to pay for the benefits that are going to current beneficiaries as well as the build up of their own funds. I think, I guess I'm not sure I go as far as you do, but I do think we need an add-on type of system, which would be along the lines you're mentioning in terms of people having some private ownership. And I think we need a better base of support. This probably is pay as you go for people, but it would particularly for people above say median lifetime incomes. We would be basically flattening out the benefit that they get as part of this long transition. Either way, there's a big transition that has to take place, and the dilemma with relying entirely on private savings is, for the most part, people have never, or a huge portion of people have never actually saved up the money. So you've got the dilemma of, if they have the money, a lot of them will spend it down. If they don't have the money, then you have government sort of controlling it. So,
but to be clear, I wouldn't be.
This is, I think government's going to have to come in with some minimum level of support, no matter what the transition is.
So my plan would be, I force everybody has to contribute 10% of their wages into a fund. They have their own account, but it's not managed by Wall Street. It's just invested collectively in a global index of stocks, bonds, and real estate securities, just like the Singapore Provident Fund. It was just a single fund that everybody's participating in. And then you get your money out on a cohort basis in the form of annuities. So Wall Street has no involvement here, but there's also a guarantee of a zero real return. So what you get back in retirement, let me say, once your assets are converted to inflation adjusted annuities, at that point of the conversion, your assets are going to be at least as large as what you put in adjusted for inflation. So you're guaranteed, under what I'm proposing, a minimum of a zero real return. So I think that gets at the point you're making. It can't be voluntary because people will not save on their own. They won't contribute on their own. We're seeing that in the 401k system. Such a large share of people who have the ability to contribute don't contribute enough. And then there are a lot of people that aren't participating at all because their employer isn't participating. So that's been a disaster from my perspective. So you have to force people to save, and you have to force the investment to be diversified with no cost, global, indexed, no involved, and then you can, that's really kind of what happened in the corporate world when they had all these defined benefit plans that were underfunded in the 80s and 90s. They converted all of them to DC plans, right? But they grandfathered the old DB plans. I think they did this in a way to screw their workers, because the workers were about to, middle-aged workers were at the age where they if those old systems had stayed in place, they would have accrued much higher benefits over the next few years because the benefit formulas were based on service. So IBM and these other companies virtually all of corporate America had DB plans. They switched to DC plans. In the process, they ripped off tens of millions of workers.
We've done a lot of work at the Urban Institute, the Retirement Project, mainly looking at state and local plans, but others. But basically, the classic defined benefit plan was always designed to mainly favor the senior workers who had been there a long time, and to give very little often to the junior workers, particularly those who move from job to job. Because as you know, it's if you leave an employment right. that has a DB plan at mid age, say midlife, your benefit isn't indexed at all even for inflation from the time you leave at 45 to when you finally get benefits at 65 or whatever. I think that's partly because my sense of history is these DB plans came along when employers sort of said, well, my older workers really been around, and I want to help them out, and they never sort of figured out what that really meant for everybody else within the firm. I actually think this is not unrelated to why unions have failed, is that in many cases are fallen in terms of membership, is because they often have not represented younger workers. And I think that's even true. A lot of the disputes that are going on now is that the younger workers really are not being that represented by all these efforts to protect the older workers. So
I agree 100%. Older senior management in these non-unionized firms wanted to basically rip off people with these complicated formulas that benefited them, that they knew would benefit them, and the same thing with the older.
Well, what's going on in all these state and local reforms is that the elected officials don't want to ask the taxpayers to pay, and they don't want to ask the older workers to pay. And so what they've done, in part, they still haven't solved the problem, but in part, they've basically decided that they're going to make a defined benefit plan that literally taxes younger workers, so that younger workers, when they leave, they come into, say, teaching, and they do it for 20 years and leave. They come out with a benefit that's less than the much higher rate of contribution, the present value of the contributions they're required to make. So that the tax is now being imposed upon younger workers with a negative employer-provided benefit, at least net employer-provided benefit. So this is still going on.
Which means we will not have people going into teaching or staying in teaching who are qualified to do it. So the whole thing is really a picture of generational expropriation, a picture of a kind of a national, decades-long Ponzi scheme that's ripping off successive generations in many different ways to the benefit of current generations. And I think my view is that this is happening in our country where it's not happening, let's say, in Scandinavia, because we're so heterogeneous that, and because of that, we don't see other people's kids as our kids. I think this is very tribal, that each of us is after our own welfare, taking care of our own kids, but we're not concerned about, if we're white, about the black kid who's not going to get a decent education and is going to have to pay, super high taxes, confiscatory taxes to help pay off my benefit. And same thing for the black parent who's not concerned about the white kid. I think there's something really fundamental about why our society is operating this way that goes beyond just, the facts of the matter. That there's something.
I agree in part, but I'm a little more sanguine. I think many of these problems were created accidentally by people who really didn't understand what they were doing. Like the Social Security reforms in the 70s that created all this automatic growth. They were basically trying to make sure that benefits per person stayed sort of whatever same level they had achieved in the past. They did more than that because they didn't deal with a lot of issues. I don't think they had fully thought through all the generational consequences at all. I say the same thing for, I think, when employers initially set up these defined benefit plans, they were trying to be sympathetic to their older workers. They really hadn't thought through what this meant if they really had to fully fund these plans for everybody else. Which once Congress started requiring that, got them to actually back out of making them.
I have
The dilemma where you're right is once people have this set of promises, and you say, well, wait a second, we've got to cut back on your promises to be able to do something for, you mentioned the black kid who's being neglected in the educational system, are the working family, which I think are in the same boat. We call the working families often the blue collar workers, the people who aren't, don't have the college education. To be able to help them, we've actually sort of got to cut back on what the rest of us have all been promised, and that's where it becomes an appeal to selfishness. And then both political parties play to that game, right? They say, well, Larry, you're entitled to your Social Security benefits. Larry, you're entitled not to have your taxes increased because we've already promised that. And all of a sudden you say, oh, that's right. It's, I'm convinced somebody else is the problem. It's those damn Democrats or damn Republicans over there who it's, if I'm not rich, it's the rich. If I'm rich, it's the people that won't work. It's always somebody else when we think somebody's asking us, they're taking something away from us.
So I don't think, I guess
if you have a system that hasn't made so many promises, it's just more natural to say, well, yeah, there's a problem in Ukraine. We got increased revenues. Let's put some of those revenues there, because I'm not necessarily asking people. I mean, technically, I'm taking money away because the rising taxes come with the rising economy, but I'm not taking away something people feel they've been promised.
Yeah. Well, I guess, I agree, except that I think this is more systematic expropriation than I don't think it was accident. I think I developed, as this system of fiscal accounting called generational accounting and fiscal gap analysis that looks long term. And we're going back now to like 1989 when we first did, Alan Auerbach and Jagdish Gokhale first put out this study of generational accounting, a methodology that has been used and is now systematically being used by the European Union. Every 3 years, they have a fiscal sustainability study for all the 27 members of the European Union. They do fiscal gap accounting and look through the infinite horizon at whether or not you need tax hikes to pay for all the outlays that have been promised, taking into account all the demographics and everything. So I've gone to successive directors of this Congressional Budget Office and said, you have to just stop doing this current deficit accounting, because the deficit is missing all the stuff that's kept off the books, and start doing fiscal gap accounting and supplement that with generational accounting that shows exactly what the burden will be on future generations if we current generations don't pay more or take less. And they've refused to do it. Both the Republicans and Democratic.
You're discounting your success because they really have gotten more into infinite horizon, at least accounting for liabilities. That's partly due to your pressures. It's not the full generation accounting.
In Social Security, but not for the entire budget.
Right.
Social Security, but I just tell you and the listeners here a story, an anecdote about if you look at the trustees report for Social Security, there isn't this infinite horizon unfunded liability, looks at the present value of all the projected benefits minus present value of all the projected receipts, including, and also takes into account the trust fund, treats it as a real asset. That difference right now is 65.9 trillion, as I mentioned earlier. So how did that calculation come to be? Well, Paul O'Neill, who was the Secretary of Treasury in 2002, was also the chief trustee, and he decided, because Kent Smetters, one of my co-authors, and Jagdish Gokhale were working at the Treasury, they convinced Paul to put this into the trustees report. So it's been there ever since. It's been pushed further and further back into the appendix, but it's been there. But then Paul O'Neill was also trying to do fiscal gap accounting for the entire fiscal operation, for the entire government, not just for Social Security. And Jagdish and Kent, he assigned them to take a whole group of people to Treasury, and for a year they put together this study that was going to be in the president's budget. And President Bush, the younger, Bush 2, remember he had this VP Cheney. Cheney did not want this to appear in the budget because they were trying to cut taxes or increase spending. They wanted to run a large deficit and not make it clear that we couldn't afford that. So if you recall, Paul O'Neill was fired. And the very next day, this entire project of fiscal gap analysis for the U.S. government, comprehensive, was censored. They closed down the entire study. They did not include it in the federal budget. President's budget was coming out about 2 months later. This has happened time and again. This is not, to me, accident or just people not thinking carefully. This is systematic.
No, I understand the political side of it. I guess I was referring more to some of the early decisions that were made, as opposed to now reporting on the dilemma that's been created, which is now backward looking and saying, let's admit the problem we're creating, which means we have to do something about it. That's different than the creation of the problem in the first place. But let me just mention, the one thing I've done, which is related to what you do, but it's not exactly the same thing, but I think tries to explain some of this in a little simpler manner. For well over a decade now, maybe it's 2 decades, I've been putting out this annual study of lifetime benefits and taxes for each generation, going all the way back to beneficiaries, I think, starting in 1960. So for over a course of 100 years. Now, it makes a very simple assumption. It's hypothetical people, and I use the Social Security's assumption on average earnings, so on and so forth, for people. But for a typical couple that earns average earnings their entire life, I usually take a couple that has average earnings for the higher earner and a low wage earner for the second earner. Uh-huh. And I look at what their lifetime benefits are. Well, actually, I do it for all sorts of people, but I'm just giving this as an example here. If you look back around somebody retiring about 1960, lifetime benefits were about $300,000, $350,000. If you go to about 2015, they got to over $1 million. If you go to today, this is in current dollars, constant dollars, in today's dollars. Mm-hmm. You go to today, it's about 1.3 million. And if you go to a millennial couple, it goes up to $2 million. Now, this is Social Security and Medicare together. And I also do the lifetime taxes, at least the taxes that are dedicated to the trust funds. And those never keep up. So the differential is huge for every generation. So each generation keeps getting promised much more than they're putting into the system. But to me, that's a way of explaining very simply, not simply that the system's unsustainable, even though technically speaking, that's not what these numbers prove. But they also give elected officials some sense of, when they do reform, how much are they providing to each generation. They can actually look at numbers like that and say, okay, how much do I want to adjust lifetime? How much should lifetime benefits go up for high income, for middle income, for low income people? And when I put it in a lifetime benefit context, it also allows more easier ways to trade off things like longer lives in retirement vis-a-vis a higher annual benefit. Turns out the failure, and I've got a number of studies on this, the failure to adjust for mortality is a very regressive provision, mainly benefiting high income people. The reason being that if you take people in the bottom quintile, over 40% of them either never make it to age 62 or are already retired on disability. So, so looking at lifetime benefits per person or per couple at different income levels is a way to actually, in a more narrow sense, get at some of the generational issues that you're talking about. But also, when you do reform, to think about what you want a generation retiring in 2050 to look like relative to a generation that's going to be retiring in a few years in 2030.
So Gene, as we wind up here, since it's been about an hour, I think we've done a pretty good job depressing everybody about the realities of our fiscal condition and the fact that the politicians are not really doing their aren't responsible, and maybe understanding a little bit about why this is happening in the U.S. but not in other countries, about our failure to be kind of connected as a people. Assuming this is going to continue, and assuming we're going to have economic and financial distress, do you have any kind of personal finance advice for, let's say, somebody who's 25 listening to this? What they should do? Should they not count on Social Security? Should they look to leave the country? And I mean, seriously, is that something that if you were 25 and single, that you would, and you thought there was just no hope that the U.S. was going to get its act together here, and that we're going to have sky high tax rates and low benefits?
I would start off by doing something I haven't done very much in our discussion together. I would give the optimistic side of this.
Go ahead.
We're an extremely rich country. I did a piece recently noting that GDP per household just recently exceeded $200,000 per couple. It doesn't take a lot of bending of these growth curves to solve the problem. You know, it might not solve the problem in the near term. Near term, we've got some fixes we have to do, but long term, for the 25-year-old, it's pretty easy to economically solve the problem. Just get those growth curves on the right path, where they're not absorbing all these additional revenues, and devote them to the things we can do better. And that compounds over time, and especially for the 25-year-old, it means that the fix is moderately easy economically. Politically, it's difficult because we're asking people to back away from the promises. In terms of their personal finance, I would say it's nothing that you haven't really put out in a number of your pieces of software and other things that people can buy. But you know, diversify well. Make sure you have a solid base upon which you rely. And I think some Social Security is going to be there for you if you're young. Don't worry about that. I think some amount of health care is going to be there for you. But then build for the long run on top of that base, because if you get into real assets, that's housing, that's stocks, as opposed to just lending to other people, which is sort of like a savings account. You get into the real assets, you get into the higher rate of return type of financial opportunity that can really compound over time, and be willing to save a bit from the start, so that you can really get that compounding going. It includes paying off debt, by the way, as a form of saving. And you're likely to come out pretty well in the long run.
Good. Well, listen, thanks so much. This has been fun and depressing at the same time, but we're ending on an upbeat note. People need to save and take responsibility for themselves, because fundamentally you can't trust Uncle Sam or your employer to be your father or mother in this context. You have to really realize that they're not going to be your friend necessarily into the future. So, Gene, thanks so much. I want to ask everybody to subscribe to, remind me of the name of the Substack.
Government We Deserve.
The governmentwedeserve.substack.com. This is Gene Steuerle's Substack newsletter. And look up Gene on the internet. Check out his Wikipedia page. Go by Dead Men Ruling, is it?
That's right.
And his other books, and you will get really well versed in what's really going on in our fiscal world and our policy world. So again, thanks so much, Gene.
Thank you, Larry, and let me re-recommend your listeners to make sure they're on your Substack column as well.
Okay, thank you.